so that when the delegates do meet, they have information to read and digest to help them in their task. And I give some examples of different, some of these were government, executive governors commissions, like Herbert Lehman's and Mario Cuomo's in '93. Some of them were established by the legislature in conjunction with the governor. So what's missing in this? Does it look like there's something missing here? Oh, yes. After the delegates are selected, in the following year, the convention meets. April 2019. They meet for about 4 months, usually that's the typical pattern. And at the end of that period, they finish their work. The Constitution requires that 6 weeks be available between the time they finish their work and the time the vote takes place, which would mean probably the vote on this Constitution that they propose, or the amendments that they propose, would be November of 2019. If those measures are approved, they would take effect in New York January 1 of 2020. That's the process. And I don't know why that's not up there, unless I gave you an earlier version. But that's the process that we would be taking you through. So, okay, would you put the other document up there? And I think there's further information you have, somebody that also provides you with some information about that. Selection of delegates, okay. While she's doing it, I might mention that Assemblyman Paul mentioned that we've been better at balancing budgets in recent years. And I don't deny that. But there's a profoundly serious problem with budgets in New York that have nothing to do with this facade of balanced budgets. And two people who have done some major studies of this issue, budget, Richard Ravitch and Paul Volcker, have analyzed these. New York has had since 2000 structural deficits, independent of whether the budget in year by year is balanced. And the way they do that is, because they use cash accounting, is that they have these one-shot infusions, or they delay payment, or they do what they call sweeps. They take funds from other parts of the government and put them in the budget, so it covers the deficits. The point is, we are not bringing in enough revenue to cover the budget expenses. So how can you have a balanced budget? Well, you don't have a balanced budget. And if they didn't use cash accounting, we would all see that. But we don't see that. That's a profound problem. And at some point, we're going to have to face that issue down the line. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of the way the budget's working. Okay. Why should we bother with the Constitution? Why is this important, this matter of the Constitutional Convention? And I would start with this statement. The most basic question that anyone can ask about any political system is whether it's capable of governing effectively. Governing effectively means a government capable of doing its job and doing it without threatening the values to which we are committed. We achieve these goals in our tradition by way of a government under a constitution. Sounds like basic civics, but it's profoundly important before you can begin to answer questions about do we need a convention and what should we do in this convention. There's a threefold traditional answer to this question. Constitutions articulate the aspirations of the citizens. And our Constitution does it. There are some positive things about our Constitution. The forever wild provision, the care for the needy, social welfare, housing, labor rights, various things that are important, valuable contributions that our Constitution has developed over the years. 2, organize the government with sufficient power to act with efficiency and responsiveness while limiting its power to prevent its abuse. Here it's clear that our government is not operating with efficiency. Our legislature is simply, by almost any measure, not succeeding. And I'll get into this if I have time. And 3, we create a framework for future constitutional construction. That is, to be able to change the document when it needs to change in terms of new challenges and new crises. I put it this way. If we accept this as a shorthand summary, the Constitution is designed to shape and channel and discipline future political judgments, how does our Constitution measure up? And what does such an assessment tell us about the task facing people who think the document needs to be reformed? Substantial differences, similarities notwithstanding, there are profound differences between our document and the National Constitution. I'm just going to mention one because it's the most important one. In the National Constitution, you have a phrase that says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Is such a provision in the state constitution? The state shall have the power to regulate commerce in the state of New York? Of course not. Is there a necessary and proper clause in the state constitution? No, because the states are governments of plenary powers. That means they have full powers to do what they need to do as long as it's consistent with the national constitution and whatever limits are in the state constitution. So we don't have, if you go to the legislative article in New York, you won't see a list of powers. It's not necessary. That's one of the major differences. That's part of the reason why the document is much longer. We put a lot of policies in there. We put a lot of things we want the state to do. And we put them in there so the state will do them. It's not the only reason. All right. New York has held 9 constitutional conventions. And we've adopted 4 constitutions. We've been quite willing in the past to have constitutional conventions, to examine our document, and to put a new one forth before the public. That willingness, it seems to me, has waned in the last 50 years, for reasons which are worth exploring, but at another time. Our constitutions have mattered in this state. They've helped preserve our liberty. They've helped to foster diversity, social welfare, tolerance, and enterprise. They've provided an evolving framework for self-government, for order and liberty, for adapting to the astonishing changes that have taken place in this state over the past couple hundred years. Well, what can a convention do? Why should we have one in light of this constitutional tradition? How will it make things better? For one, constitutional change could make local as well as state governments more efficient, economical, and responsible. The Constitution has a provision that says home rule shall be guaranteed to all local governments. Well, hardly. Fiscal autonomy is not one of the conditions that characterizes local government. There are debt restrictions, tax restrictions, there are unfunded mandates, the requirements of the state constantly being imposed upon local governments. Now, it may be that some of these are necessary, but we have never come to grips with this problem of the gap between home rule as a fundamental principle of Article 9 and the practice of this state. I think that's an issue that could be addressed, like you mentioned. Take the debt limits. There are debt limits on the local governments. But you know, those debt limits are phantoms. There are so many exceptions to these debt limits. IDAs are not governed by these debt limits. There are so many exceptions to the debt limits that, in fact, when you look at it, states are borrowing far more than what the Constitution appears to give them the power to. Now, just because this debt is exempted from the Constitution doesn't mean that it's not debt. Many localities are in serious financial problems because of the debt load. That's an issue that we need to address. So, as I mentioned, the next one, when you couple the many exemptions, the actual debts of local governments is much greater than the debt that is set in the constitutions. So while it's exempted debt, it's debt nonetheless. It's got to be paid. We have a constitution, take the state level, that limits debt to debt, general debt, to those debts that are approved by the voters at a referendum. 94% of the general obligation debt of this state is not referendum approved debt. Only 6%. So the Constitution says one thing, the reality of New York State government says something else. Currently, we have no institutional mechanism that limits the amount of debt this state can incur Is that a satisfactory situation? Is that acceptable? That's a question you have to answer. We have a court system that says it's consolidated, but it's far from it. We select judges, supposedly, according to the Constitution, by elections. But we all know that's a joke. Across the doors, either there's simply no choice, or the one party is so dominant in an area that that judge will win. Nobody gets to the judgeships unless they're part of the political insiders. So a lot of competent people have to be, this is self-interested academics, who don't get involved in politics, are simply not considered. So if we want to elect judges, then let's elect them, but we don't elect them. It's another example of the gap between what the Constitution says and what happens out there. I think it's a scandal to have judges do what they have to do, come up with $100 grand to get on the ballot, and then do the unseemly things they have to do to get elected. Does anybody think that's acceptable? I shouldn't say that's a rhetorical question because I suspect for some it isn't a rhetorical question. Yes, we should continue to have elected judges, but we don't have that. We have a legislature that's incapable or unwilling to govern. It picks leaders who can't seem to avoid indictment. And members who participate and perpetuate this pay-for-play culture. The bizarre, obvious cocktail parties, the hundreds of fundraising sessions held while the legislature is in session, within walking distance of the Capitol, as if to parade it in front of our eyes. In short, we have a legislature that bears little resemblance to the legislature described in our Constitution. Is that a satisfactory situation? Legislatures have willingly abdicated power and policymaking to leaders who are only too happy to relieve them of the onerous, time-consuming, and contentious duties of holding hearings, of conducting oversight investigations. They don't have to do these things. They can go about the business of working their districts, raising campaign funds, receiving goodies to benefit their constituents back home. I can remember going into Sam Hoyt's office one year, a few years ago. Now he's on the New York, some commission, Bridge Commission or something. Somebody help me out here. He's on one of them. I was sitting in his office waiting to speak to him. We were going to talk about a constitutional convention. And I'm looking around the office. These pictures of every group, unbelievable, thanking him for what he's done for them. I said, but how could this guy not get elected? He's given something to every significant, important, good group in his district. That's part of getting elected. It's not part of governing. It's part of getting elected. That has created democratic centralism. The press calls it 3 men in the room. I call it, after the good classic Leninist phrase, democratic centralism. After the majority has made up its mind, there is no dissent. They stick together. The policy statements, in other words, is part and parcel of the profound entrenchment of power. The legislature has striven to keep its membership as unchanging as its policies. Gerrymandering. We don't. The argument goes, I've heard it said, we don't pick the legislatures. The legislatures pick us. That's what gerrymandering is about. Arcane election laws, unreformed campaign finance practices, protect incumbents and preserve the existing majorities, generous mailing privileges, and other taxpayer finance that come into debate to skew election outcomes even further. Many state legislative races are not even remotely competitive. Now, I can't blame this on the legislature. New York's political makeup is such that no matter how you spread the districts, one party is going to be or tend to be more dominant. You can't fault the Democrats if there are more Democrats than there are Republicans. That doesn't mean you can't draw the district lines in a fair way. Between 1985 and 2005, incumbents won re-election over 98% of the time. And we go through, I don't want to go through all the figures, the press has done it very well. The fact is that more people in New York have lost their seats in the assembly by virtue of indictment than by virtue of losing an election. Now, that may be an exaggeration. An indictment or some questionable behavior. Now, I have to say, I'm not saying this simply because of Assemblyman Bryan's here, this is not the picture of all that. In the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, there are people in both parties who care about the institution, who want things to get done, and often tend to try and get these things done. But I don't envy their task. Now you might ask, what's this got to do with the Constitution? Much of what it needs could take the form of statutory reform, which the legislature, of course, is loath to enact. So what does the Constitution have to do with it? Plenty. And this will be my final point. This is, to me, the most important point. We have to understand the kind of vicious cycle that we have created in this state. We're all aware the low-esteem voters hold the legislature. They think it's not doing a good job, it's broken, and it's not capable of reforming itself. The consequences of this distrust are profound for effective government. The pervasive suspicion, because the pervasive suspicion is willy-nilly, that it's shotgun, it doesn't, like a laser, focus on the things that you need to be suspicious about. It reflects itself across the board to the legislative body. So when the legislature does pass a substantive constitutional proposal, the public is suspicious of it. The reforms in 1995 and the attempts to redress the imbalance between the governor and the legislature are cases in point. Both were seen by the electorate as ways for the legislature to spend more money or to increase its power. Now, I didn't see it that way, at least with regard to the question of budget power. I happen to think there is an imbalance between the governor and the legislature in the budget-making process. But it's difficult to convince me and the voters that this legislature ought to be given any more power. You see the problem? I'm reluctant to give this legislature anything, but I think there is an imbalance. That is the link between trust and effective government. Why should we entrust them with greater responsibility? Trust, then, can be seen as a constitutional problem. It makes the electorate unwilling or reluctant to accept proposals that might begin to break this vicious cycle.
Peter, please hold the mic up.
Oh, am I not talking loud enough? Okay. I thought, I've always said, quiet down. She says, it's early in the morning. You sound like somebody. But you're right. Thank you. I will. Okay, so effective government is more likely with high trust. In turn, high trust generates more effective governance and makes dysfunction less likely. Now, a constitution, here's the constitutional issue, sets the conditions for a government institution and processes that will be able to reproduce the conditions required for effective governance over time. Our institutions have stopped producing this trust. That is the point we need to see. Having ruptured that relationship, we are caught in a vicious cycle. Since the constitutional structure sets the conditions required for effective government, it is to that structure that we must turn to break the cycle. That means constitutional reforms. Here, there are legitimate grounds for disagreement. Brian made some very good points today about the issue of dedicated legislature, and I take seriously a dedicated legislature, campaign finance reform, strict limits on outside income, strict code of ethics, independent redistricting committee, perhaps term limits on leadership, if not the members themselves. These would go far to require the legislature to be a kind of new body. But how do you get the legislature that suffers from systematic blockages and personal inadequacies, the very conditions we want to remove, to reform themselves? That's the cycle that I'm talking about. So, because the constitutional structure sets the conditions required, it's to that structure we must turn to break the cycle. And that mandatory 20-year ballot question is a chance for us to at least think about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, no guarantees, just maybe, this is our opportunity to do for the legislature, not to the legislature, for the legislature, what needs to be done. Does this mean that the convention will be called? And if called, will it address these problems? What can we do to see that the convention will address these issues? These are my just final reflections. What we are doing now is the beginning, okay? This is civic education of the highest order. Second, we need to get involved in the process in a variety of ways affecting the delegate selection process. I know that the League of Women Voters and many others complain that, well, the delegate selection process is such that the same old get in there and nothing will happen. I've heard that argument made in 77 and 97. I'm going to hear it again in 2017. But that's an excuse. We need to push the legislature to revise election law concerning delegate selection, making it easier to get on the ballot. That's a start. Provide for limited voting so that diversity of candidates may be achieved. They can do that. Or cumulative voting. So, did you have a
What
question?
does limited voting mean?
Limited voting means, you know, if you have if it's 3 senators, three delegates in a senatorial district, and you have you vote for 3 candidates, and let's say take the race case, and you're white, and the whites are in majority, you vote for 3 whites, and they get in, and no minority gets elected. If you use a cumulative votes or limited voting, voters can't do that. And if the minority in the district reaches a certain level, it's able to elect a delegate if it so desires to collect its votes. It's a little complicated, but there are 2 schemes that would create more diversity. And a number of people have advocated these things for dealing with this problem. We may not need to deal with that so much because now the Senate is no longer an automatic Republican conclave. It's very close, the Democrat-Republican balance in the Senate. And with 15 delegates being elected statewide, well, the statewide figures are clearly Democratic. It is not likely that it will be an automatic Republican convention. That was one of the concerns. I don't think that's going to happen. Pass legislation that says, here's the controversial one. Legislators or judges who wish to serve as delegates, they can do so, but they can't hold their position at the same time. To me, the single most important thing we can do. And finally, if we do the former, we don't have to worry about the latter. Failing all these, there's no excuse to vote against the convention, in my view, because we must organize the candidates with an independent spirit and with one aim in mind, to address the problems of our government and constitution, with no other goal than to make a new New York. And no party has a monopoly on those kind of people. I know Democrats who have powerful concerns about the independent, important character of our Constitution, and I know Republicans. And voters must be able to discern who they are and vote for them. We don't have to worry about a party wrapped up in a narrow partisan majority, if we do that. So, where's the clock? How am I doing? 2 minutes. Okay, what do I have? Okay. This vicious cycle. Now I'm getting a little too excessive. Is the watermill of opponents who use the argument that a convention. Judy, can you flip that to my last page? I'm not going to go into this. I think I've said enough. You understand the point about the dilemma we're in and what we need to do when we decide whether the convention is worth it. There are lots of legitimate questions and arguments about a convention that need to be addressed and to be thought about. And I'm not about to dismiss those out of hand. And we need to think about them. But these are the kinds of questions, I think, this is the context that you need to have when you go into that voting booth and decide, is this the right thing for New York? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now is the time to hear from you, if you have questions for our panel. I would like to use the prerogative to ask one question to start with. Both Brian and Peter alluded to part of the problems of good legislation is the rules under which the legislators operate, under which the Assembly and the Senate choose their leaders and process potential legislation. It seems to me that most constitutions have been created under the assumption that legislatures will act like gentlemen and do a nice job of operating under Robert's Rules of Orders with fair hearings of people debating in the classic style that we learned back in Civics 101. And they just basically leave the drafting of rules of operation to the legislatures themselves. The legislature creates its own rules. It's probably more for Peter. Are you aware of any state constitutions that get more definitive and actually get into some of the operating procedures under which the legislature has to operate that can help assure an operation that is closer to the ideal that we have in mind?
Actually, we have some of the New York Constitution, whether they're effective or not. For example, I think, Brian can help me, there's a rule, a 3/5 rule for measures involving financial spending that must be met. That's in both houses, isn't it, that you have to have a 3/5 rule? Is that correct? Chris, am I not right on that?
I think it's for certain appropriations.
Certain appropriation bills.
Certain bills that are 3/5 bills.
Have to require 3/5. That's an example of a procedural protection. There are a whole series of, I think there are 17 in the legislative article areas that the legislature is not permitted to make legislation on. The message of necessity is an example to regulate this. I think somebody called this absolutely right. It's a failed provision. It's been used for reasons that have nothing to do with what it was intended to do. It's used as a convenience for the legislature and to enhance the power of the governor. That's not what that was meant for. And Chris and I can give it a shameless plug and a full-length analysis of the entire history of this message of necessity. And it becomes a central conclusion that Senator Cobb does. He knows it from the inside. We see it from the outside. It's no longer what it's supposed to do. We have about a new procedure about salaries that have just been put in. How salary increases are going. And the procedure seems to be directly counter to what the Constitution says. In effect, has the effect of hiding the decision from the public when it's made. I don't know whether that answers it.
Yeah, well, you want to comment, someone?
Well, there is operating rules that each house creates. So in other words, the Senate, and how the Senate, if you will, processes legislation and how they take their votes is totally different than the Assembly. But quite frankly, the basics are the same, and that is majority rules. And so even when you had the Republicans not in full control, they had the coalition with the IDC, it was about trying to ensure that they had 32, 33 votes on a particular issue, because simple majority wins. In the state assembly, it's the same thing. You have to have 76 votes to pass a bill. But for instance, just in talking about an internal rules change, is that years ago in the assembly, once you carted in, you basically said, okay, I'm here in Albany, I'm going to swipe in. If you were going to vote yes, you didn't have to go to the chamber. And since the Democrats had overwhelming numbers in the chamber, a lot of Democrats didn't show up to vote because they knew what the agenda was going to be. They had already signed off as a conference, and so many times you had, like, if you will, 40–50% of the elected members not even in the body to hear debates, etc. Well, that rule got changed internally based on our pushing things, where now you have to be in the chamber and vote yes or no. You actually have to push the button, yes or no. So there are internal rules, but also the judiciary has interpreted and ruled that there are certain things that the legislature and the legislative bodies can do on their own without judicial interference unless it was actually spelled out in the Constitution.
All right. Anybody out there? Okay, well, let's give you the mic, because...
Give me the mic.
Just say after they speak up.
and then the gentleman behind you be next.
Okay, my question is with We okay?
No,
Okay,
actually,
okay.
somebody else.
Okay. My question was with respect to the delegation or the delegate selection process. Who decides the rules for that? Who gets?
So the selection of delegates,
Yes.
outside of the comments made in the constitutional article itself, the legislature. The legislature determines that. And in the past, in 65, for example, it simply adopted the rules in place for conducting elections in the state. And that is partisan elections, the same requirements to get on the ballot, party nominations, the like. Those rules were simply applied to delegate selection. We don't think that should happen, but that's what they have done in the past. But they can change that. They can make it nonpartisan, they can change the voting procedures and the like.
What is that likely to happen?
I've introduced a piece of legislation, which I've reintroduced and reintroduced because pieces of legislation only have a shelf life of 2 years. But bill number A 4674, and we are seeking a sponsor. And this will really become more of a current issue to really deal with, being 2016, 2017, which the bill really changes the delegate process. And so it eliminates political parties. Peter mentioned about the fact that anyone could serve from a delegate perspective. You can't prevent a legislator or a local town official or a judge from serving. But in this bill it says if you decide to serve, great, but you have to vacate your office. Because what we don't want is the same cast of characters that are currently in the legislature transitioning over to the Constitutional Convention, because you're not going to get anything different than what we're currently doing or not doing in the state legislature. So we do have legislation to change that. It would require 3 delegates from every Senate district. There's 63 Senate districts now, plus there's 15 at-large seats. And you have to pass petitions, but they're not party petitions. It doesn't matter. Anybody can run. But you have to circulate, for instance, to be within a Senate district, you have to gather at least 1,000 registered voters. And again, without party affiliation, they just have to be a registered voter. And then let's assume you have 20 people that pass enough petitions within a Senate district, well then they have a runoff. And the top 3 vote getters are the ones that will represent the district from that particular Senate district. The at-large, anybody who wants to run at-large, which is the entire state, they have to circulate a petition and gather a minimum of 10,000 registered voter signatures to put their name on the ballot to run as a delegate.
Let me just, I was remiss in not giving Assemblyman Cobb credit for this. He, along with some others, have been pushing this issue to his credit about not simply adopting unchanged the rules for selecting delegates as they have done in the last conventions. And this is one of the most important things we can do, and he needs to be